Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the House Ways and Means Committee briefing by the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. We will get right to it. As I see, our guest is here, David Farkas, the acting chief of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. So, Mr. Farkas, when you are ready, you can take it away. And everyone should have received a packet from Sarah yesterday with information from Mr. Farkas.
Good morning. As the chair introduced me, my name is David Farkas. I'm the acting chief of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. Just a little background, I've been with the Bureau of Revenue Estimates for about 7 years now. In a management position for a few years now. I was also acting chief during the spring and summer of 2020. So it's not my first time in this position, but it is my first time addressing a legislative committee. So thank you for having me. Can I share my screen, or is someone going to put the presentation up, or is everyone just going to follow along?
I am going to put the presentation up when you're ready.
Okay.
Just
okay. Yes, I'm ready to start. Okay, so again, David Farkas, acting chief of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. If you go to the next slide, it's a detailed table of the changes that we made in our December forecast, most recent revenue forecast. Important things to note here. This is for everyone's reference. A summary of the most important changes is on the next slide. So you can see the kind of changes from September are in the first column there. So for example, the personal income tax, we wrote up our fiscal 22 expectations about $261 million. And we expect the personal income tax to grow 3% in fiscal 22. Corporate income tax, we wrote down marginally due to lower than expected refunds. The sales tax, I think, is the most notable one. We wrote it up, the board approved a write-up of $226 million in fiscal 22. So we now expect it to grow 10.5% off of the fiscal 21 base, which was just a unfathomable rate of growth pre-pandemic. For the sales tax, we were, thought of ourselves as lucky to get 2% growth a year. Before the pandemic, the sales tax has grown considerably faster during the pandemic, in large part. That's due to a shift in consumption towards goods and away from services in reaction to the pandemic. So, less indoor dining, for example, more online shopping. Those are the major changes. If you put everything together, our write-up for fiscal 22 was $495 million. And for fiscal 23 was $543 million. I'll just note right here, there's a lot of uncertainty going forward, especially in the out years. Our general approach has been to kind of assume a return to trend once the pandemic is past us, or effectively past us, but when that is going to happen is not something that's very easy to predict. I'm sure everyone's personal experience speaks to that. But fiscal 22, the current forecasts and the write-up from December are based largely on year-to-date trends based on revenue that's come in the door. So I think we can feel pretty confident about that number, fairly confident, that the next year will be a continuation largely, but once you get beyond that, there's a ton of uncertainty. And our, the Omicron wave, we know it's very big, but we've yet to see kind of a flow through impact on revenues. But certainly, a significant change in the course of the pandemic will result in, changes to our forecast, though fiscal 22 again is based on just the revenue that's coming in the door. So is, the most confident year we have of our forecast. If you go to the next slide, this shows what's called the employment population ratio. This is national data. I think this is not the most commonly used indicator, but I think it captures the uniqueness of the pandemic, recession, and recovery in one statistic. It's it's employment divided by the population. So it's the share of the population that's employed. It's indexed back to January 2020. So the line shows kind of the percent change in employment relative to the population since January 2020. So you can see that in total, we're at an employment to population ratio that's about 6 percentage points lower than it was pre-pandemic. And this captures, both employment and, for example, the employment rate is very low again, but the level of employment remains below its prior peak. And that's only possible because labor force participation has dropped. That's in the labor force is the amount of people who are employed and the amount of people who are actively looking for jobs. And a key note there is that when people leave the labor force, it is more difficult to bring them back into the labor force than it is to bring unemployed workers back into employment. And I believe that's why you see a fairly rapid recovery in the middle of the second half of 2020. And then since then, it's been a pretty slow and prolonged and incomplete recovery in the labor market. And go to the next slide, that shows some of our withholding data and jobs data within the state of Maryland by industry. The key point takeaway here is that job losses were concentrated in the industries worst affected by the pandemic. So you see accommodations and food services remains below its prior peak, whereas other industries that were less immediately affected, such as administrative and waste services, have almost recovered. We had lost 400,000 jobs from January to April 2020, and we are, as of October 21, where we were still 91,000 below that peak. The other key takeaway here is that job losses were concentrated in industries in general that pay lower average wages than the average wage of all jobs in Maryland. So that's to say that job losses were concentrated more in lower income employment. And that's mattered a lot for our tax revenue because lower income workers pay a smaller proportion of their income in taxes So this is one reason that the state's income tax revenue is held up fairly well, because higher wage employment held up better and has fully recovered, while lower wage employment lags. The next slide shows aggregate wages in Maryland in both real and nominal terms. So the red line is just the dollar amount, total wages. The blue line is adjusted for inflation. And so you can see we had a substantial dip back in the second quarter of 2020 and have experienced significant wage growth in terms of total wages since then, despite employment lagging in the recovery. On the real wage side, I put in a linear trend line just to show that in inflation adjusted terms, the wage growth we've experienced puts us more or less back on the pre-pandemic trend. So, we've notched up some impressive nominal wage growth figures, but when you adjust it for inflation, wage growth has more or less kind of kept up with inflation and back on our pre-pandemic trend. The next slide shows Maryland's real and nominal average hourly wage. So the prior slide was just total dollar value of wages paid. This is the average hourly wage. The average wage often spikes in recessions because of cuts to employment, especially this time. As I said, the job losses were concentrated in lower wage industries, which led to a higher average wage. And since then, in real terms, inflation adjusted terms, the average wage has subsided a bit. And that's pretty typical. As the labor market recovers, you bring back workers who became unemployed. Since those losses were concentrated in lower wage employment, the average wage should come down as those workers re-enter the labor force. The next slide shows the state's quarterly income tax withholding collections. You can see there's a seasonal pattern going on there, but they are climbing and continued to climb throughout the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we felt ourselves to be fortunate to have about 4% growth in income tax withholding a year. It's currently fluctuating quite a bit, but averaging around 8 to 10%. So, income tax withholding growth has accelerated through the pandemic, and as a result, spending as well, and that's why you see the sales tax figures we have. The next slide shows personal income tax receipts attributable to by the tax year that they're attributable to. So basically the calendar year that this income was earned. The orange line is adjusted for the impacts of law changes. So from our perspective, estimating revenue is the more important one to make sure that the impact of law changes isn't throwing off our models. But you can see that growth in total net receipts for the personal income tax was very high in tax year 2020. And that is not what we expected going into the pandemic. And we certainly didn't expect that to be the strongest year of income tax growth in a while. And that's what's really buoyed fiscal 21 income tax revenue. And we do expect that income tax, the total net receipts growth to decline on a tax year basis, but to still be pretty strong in tax year 21. And if you go to the next slide, this kind of puts I think it helps contextualize what's going on with our sales tax receipts. The blue line is disposable personal income, and that's the income individuals have available to spend. You can see that never fell during the pandemic, and in fact, there were two prominent peaks of growth in disposable personal income. The tops of those peaks are the times that people got stimulus checks from the federal government. And the kind of opaque, the translucent kind of pinkish looking lines are the savings rate. So the savings rate became significantly elevated throughout the pandemic. It has since come down, but it is still positive. And so that means that households have significantly more savings now than they had before the pandemic. So, to me, the story here is essentially that government stimulus efforts, both nationally and state level, both fiscal policy, monetary policy, were all put to work to support income during the pandemic. So despite the worst labor market conditions since the Great Depression, the income that individuals received continued to grow. In the aggregate, people spent a share of that, but they also saved a share of that and have increased savings, more savings than they had before. And that gives me confidence that the sales tax will continue to grow at an elevated level in the near term, just because consumers have savings available to them even without any additional stimulus measures. And there isn't, I guess, as much uncertainty now as there was when the pandemic first struck. You often find in a recession, or with anything that causes a recession, there's a shock that causes people to pull back their spending. And then aggregate spending falls and we go into a recession. People certainly boosted their savings, but because their income continued to grow, that also supported total spending in the economy throughout the pandemic, which is why we had a quick recovery in terms of aggregate spending and aggregate output. The next slide shows net assets by wealth percentiles. This is data from the Federal Reserve, and they break it out by the top 1%, the net's 9%, the net's 40%, and the bottom half of wealth percentiles in the United States. And so you can see here that while all wealth percentiles benefited, it was, in terms of percent increase in net wealth, the bottom 50% has seen the largest percentage increase. Of course, that's a much smaller, dollar amount, certainly per person, than a 30% increase for the top 1%. But what this points to is that the stimulus checks, they're a fixed dollar amount for every person, regardless of their income. The unemployment expansions went to people who had lost jobs or hours of work during the pandemic. As I said earlier, those losses were concentrated in lower income positions. And so because of that, a lot of the unemployment insurance expansion went to lower wage workers. And that's why you see a larger impact in terms of percentage increase for the bottom 50% than the wealth percentiles above them. So I think this shows, just the benefit of these types of programs, particularly, the expanded unemployment insurance, and just the concept of sending money directly to individuals. I think without it being explicitly kind of targeted on that bottom 50%, the reality of the labor market conditions with these programs meant that a lot of that money did go to the bottom 50%. Most of this increase in wealth for the bottom 50% is in the form of checkable deposits, checkings and savings accounts. Whereas for the top percentiles, a lot more of this increase in wealth reflects an increase in asset prices. So to me, the summary of the economic conditions that our revenue forecast reflects is that, despite, as I said, the worst labor market conditions since the Great Depression, and despite the incomplete recovery in employment, government stimulus efforts kept income growing throughout the pandemic, which meant households were able to continue consuming, continue saving, and that really prevented a much worse economic crisis from occurring, and has allowed us to grow out of the recession in economic terms, in terms of total spending and output. So, I view it as a very successful use of kind of textbook counter-cyclical economic policy. And that to me explains the revenue forecasts and the revenue realizations we've had throughout the pandemic, because income and spending continued to grow, often at faster rates than before the pandemic. The state's tax revenues held up very well. And next slide, please. So now I'd like to turn to risks to our forecast. As I said, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's definitely much more uncertainty in our forecast horizon than we're used to. And I would say the revisions to our forecasts over the pandemic really speak to that. We've never, since I've been here, made such significant changes in such a short period of time to our forecasts. That really reflects the novelty and uncertainty of the situation we're in. Next slide, please. So of course, the biggest risk to our forecast is the COVID pandemic. Kind of at every time the board has approved one of our forecasts, a key assumption is that the pandemic will become less severe over time. I think that's a big risk right there, because the fact that the virus continues to evolve and that we have significant unvaccinated population, those two factors kind of sustain the pandemic and bring with them the risk of the pandemic worsening. And I put global in there because as far as supply chain disruptions, supply is determined globally. So as our kind of national, regional, state economy will be affected by the pandemic in a global sense. So what happens around the world is a risk to us here. As I said, the pandemic continues to disrupt supply. Supply, just to go back to textbook economics, supply is inflexible in the short run. It takes time to expand. It takes time to recover if it falls. Government stimulus doesn't move the supply curve. That's based on the real productive capacity of the economy. And the pandemic is disrupting that. So if you have a negative supply shock, to use the textbook term, that reduces the output the economy is capable of producing, and that causes prices to rise because there's less supply available, and that's boosting inflation figures. We expect the supply disruptions to alleviate in the short run, as we have expected the pandemic itself to alleviate over the near term. It's still kind of soon to really get at the effects of Omicron, but it could worsen supply disruptions. And at any time, a new variant or significantly, significant worsening of the pandemic could cause a new round of supply disruptions, causing a new round of inflation. And it seems very likely that there will be less monetary and fiscal stimulus going forward than there has been in the past. So we've so far found ourselves in the odd situation of revenue growth increasing during the pandemic. That relationship may not hold going forward if the pandemic worsens and the appetite for stimulus is significantly reduced. Next slide, please. So focusing a bit more on inflation and the economic policy implications. Again, in the short run, supply is inflexible. In the long run, we would expect supply to expand and real prices to fall, basically alleviating the inflation we're experiencing now. So I do consider the inflation that we're experiencing now to be a short run phenomenon. The question is, how long is the short run? There's not really a good answer to that. It's, the short run could be years. The long run is however long it takes supply to adjust. So I think there's kind of a difference in interpretation when an economist says something is a short run phenomenon, and what the average person hears. The short run is not just a few months, it could be years. We collect revenue in nominal dollars. So typically if inflation is high, that means our revenue growth will increase in line with inflation. However, when policymakers go to spend that money, inflation boosts both our revenue and it boosts costs. And so the purchasing power of each dollar of revenue has been reduced. So while it can look good on the revenue side, it doesn't necessarily translate into the ability of the government to afford more. Monetary policy has been very expansionary during the pandemic. This was necessary to avoid a much worse crisis and to cause the fairly rapid recovery we've experienced year to date. But in terms of output growth, in terms of aggregate spending in the economy, that recovery is complete. We are back on our pre-pandemic trend of nominal GDP growth, and nominal GDP is just the dollar value of output. And so that's kind of a sign, once that recovery is complete, that monetary policy has kind of done its job, and that monetary policy should be tightened to prevent the economy from overheating. So for that reason, and the Fed has recently signaled its intention to tighten sooner than it previously expected to. So, we're going to be going forward into the pandemic with less expansionary monetary policy than we've had in the past. There's risks on both sides. The Fed tightens too little, and then we overheat and have an inflationary boom that they then need to slam on the brakes later to bring inflation down. And there's the risk that they do too much and stall out the recovery, and then we see a kind of prolonged, slow recovery like we got from the Great Recession. The next slide shows some inflation forecasts. This is the average annual inflation expectations over the next 5 years. So they kind of all cluster around or just above 2%. But that's looking forward 5 years as of December 2021. And we had a lot of elevated inflation before then. So this is basically a forecast that the Fed will miss its target of 2% average inflation to the high side. So forecasters and markets currently expect the Fed to slightly miss its target to the high side, in a sense, more inflation than the Fed would prefer to have in the economy. So my background, educational background, is in economics. So the next slide has some textbook macro graphs. One on the left shows the initial phase of the pandemic recession. It was both an aggregate supply and an aggregate demand shock. So both of the aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve shift to the left. Y is output, so output falls. And then the panel to the right shows kind of the impact of the stimulus so far. Again, the stimulus doesn't move the supply curve, it moves the demand curve. But because of the supply shock, to get output back to Y0, you end up with higher prices than you had before. And those higher prices last until the supply curve can adjust. So again, this just goes to the point that the inflation we're experiencing right now is due to supply disruptions caused by the pandemic in the context of there being enough economic stimulus to get demand back to where it was before. The next graph shows that in real data. This is nominal GDP, and you can see that as of the third quarter of 2021, the most recently available data, we were back on trend, even just a little above the pre-pandemic trend. So economic stimulus is used to kind of fill the output gap in a recession. And that task has been accomplished. To me, that means that certainly monetary policy is at the point where it needs to be tightened going forward. The next slide shows another perennial risk to our forecasts. This is our forecast of taxable capital gains. 2019 is the last historical date we have for this data. It's grown, we expect that it's grown significantly over the last 2 years, and we forecast it to be flat in 2022. But I'll note that taxable capital gains, in dollar terms, are higher now than they were before the housing crisis. So this is a volatile source of income, so it's always a risk to our forecast that there's a swing in this income. I'll elaborate on this a bit more in the next slide. So speaking to non-wage income in general, over the last decade or so, non-wage income has been growing faster than wage income. As a result, it's an increasing share of state revenues. It's concentrated among the wealthiest individuals. So, it depends on the decisions made by kind of a small number of people, you know, how much tax revenue we get. You know, it's currently at very high levels. These peaks tend not to be sustained for very long. Shifts in these peaks are nearly impossible to forecast. And when they fall, they usually fall rapidly. But non-wage income is usually the first type of income to recover in any recession. So this is just to say that you know, we collect a lot of income tax from non-wage income, and that's an inherently volatile source that always presents a risk to our forecast outside of unique circumstances like the pandemic. And next slide, please. And so that concludes the presentation I prepared for you all. Not sure how much time I have, but if there's time, I'm willing to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Farkas, for that. And if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. I would like to acknowledge our state treasurer who has joined us. He's not showing his face, but he's listening. So hi, Mr. Treasurer.
Hello, Madam Chair. Hello, Ways and Means Committee.
Delegate Wilkins has a question, and then I see Delegate Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and hello, Mr. Treasurer. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for joining our committee. Yes, I thank you so much, David, for the really thorough presentation. I just wanted to know if there's anything more that can be said when we think about revenue estimates, just related to just federal funds, COVID related. There's a lot of conversation happening about surplus and things like that. If there's anything that you could just unpack for us as it relates to revenues and just federal money that has or is expected to come in.
Yes, so the Bureau of Revenue Estimates and the Board of Revenue Estimates are set up to estimate the state's general fund tax revenue. So as far as money that the federal government gives directly to the state of Maryland, you know, I think that's more of a budget side. You know, I'd refer detailed questions on that to the Department of Budget and Management. As far as forecasting the state's general fund revenue, kind of the significant points there that because the federal government used both fiscal and monetary policy at unprecedented levels, that money, you know, basically the federal government gave money to individuals, to residents of Maryland. The monetary stimulus kept spending circulating in the economy. So, you know, the flow through is that federal stimulus money went to individuals who are then able to kind of maintain spending and continue to earn income that kept employment from, you know, falling more than it otherwise would have. And so by supporting kind of the income and earnings of individuals, that supported the state's general fund tax revenue. And we've seen, you know, higher than usual income tax growth because of that. And we especially see the effects in the sales tax, that because individuals continued to receive income, they continued to spend. Because of the pandemic, that spending shifted away from services, which are generally untaxed, and towards goods, which are generally taxed. So that's the flow through as far as the general fund of the state is concerned.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Delegate Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question was answered.
Okay.
Thank
Are
you.
there any further questions for Mr. Farkas? If not, that concludes today's briefing. Thank you, Mr. Farkas, for being here. Great to see you as always, Mr. Treasurer. And I will see the committee at 1 o'clock for our bill hearing. So grab something to eat. See you soon. Bye.